Hi everyone, welcome back to the Etymon Project. Today I'm going to be going over another problem in my NACLO walkthrough series, problem C from 2025 Open Round. It's called Color Me Confused, and this one was a request from kind of a while ago, so I'm so sorry that I'm only getting to it now, but I hope this is helpful, and yeah, let's just get into it. Okay, so basically this problem is about the different terms for colors in languages and how different languages can have like different number of language terms. So for example, in English we have 11 basic terms, but then some have few as 2 or as many as 12. And then here we have a chart where it kind of shows the different color terms for each language that would describe each of these objects at the top. So for example, in Safiki, if you wanted to describe fresh grass, the color fresh grass, you would say lo simban. So that's kind of how this chart works. And then if we scroll down here, we can see that they give us a list of these rules 1 through 5. And in these rules, each object from ripe plum, ripe strawberry, etc. is given a letter from A to H. And essentially our task down here is to use these rules to figure out which object is A through H. And as you can see here, problem C1 is determine which object each of the letters refers to. So I'll give you a second to read over these rules just so you have them in mind while I'm working, because it's going to be hard to have them up while I'm working on the top page. So I'm going to try to project each rule when I'm working on it. But yeah, it should be easier if you're doing this in the actual contest. You'll have multiple pieces of paper, not working on an iPad. So I'll give you a second to look over these rules. Okay. And now let's come back up here, and one of the first things I would do in this problem is, because there's a lot of rules that are based on the number of color terms in each language, I would just go through and mark the number of color terms in each language. So for Basa, there's Hui and Ziza, so there's only 2. So I'll just write a 2 here, and then so on. So I'll just skip to when I'm done with that. Okay, so for the first rule, this might be the simplest to work with because it's kind of going over just the first 2 basic color terms, which distinguish between A and B. So 2 of these objects are going to be A and B, and they're going to have to be different for every single language, if that makes sense. So in Basa, they would have to be Hui and Ziza because those are the only 2. But in every other language, they're going to have to be 2 different words because they're always distinguishing between A and B. And these are the 2 most basic color terms. So the easiest way to start with this rule is to look at the Basa language because it only has 2. So we know one of the color terms is going to be Ziza, and we know one of the color terms is going to be Hui, which means we know A or B is going to be either ripe strawberry, ripe banana, or fresh snow. We can look at Ziza because there's less of them and kind of compare each of these columns. So this column, and this column to all of the Hui columns to see if there's any that are going to be completely different all the way through the whole chart. And that will lead us to a possible answer for the other matching column. That would be the other of A or B in this case. So we can start with ripe strawberry. As we go through, we can eliminate ripe plum for this one. We can also eliminate ripe banana. We can eliminate fresh snow because these have Ziza as well. But that's kind of it. So it doesn't tell us much, but it's definitely still a possibility that ripe strawberry is going to be one of A or B. So let's check ripe banana. It's not going to be ripe strawberry or fresh snow because they both have Ziza. It's not going to be ripe plum because this matches up. And it's not going to be any of these because they all have this same word, tire. But it still could be adult crow. So that also doesn't tell us that much, except that ripe banana could still be one of the A or B terms. And finally, let's check fresh snow. So it's not going to be ripe strawberry or ripe banana, and it's not going to be clear sky because these terms match up. But other than that, it can be any of these other columns, so fresh snow is definitely also still a possible contender. So now we might want to try to move on to a different rule to see if we can find out anything there because we can't make any definitive claims for A and B yet. So for rule number 2, it states that if it has at least 3 words, it will use different words for A, B, and C. But if it has only 3, the same word is used for both B and D. So this is pretty helpful because it tells us that if a language has 3 words, then B is going to be repeated. So if we look at the fresh snow column, we see that in these 2 languages with 3 color terms, the words Phi and Abare are not repeated, so this column cannot be B. And we can make a note of that at the top. And it also can't be D because of that same reason. And because these two are both unique, then we know that this column has to be either A or C, because essentially one of the columns from AB is going to be an A, B, or C, one of the columns from Anyaga is going to be A, B, or C, and this is the leftover, so this has to be whatever the other ones aren't, because there's only 3 different terms. So this has to be A or C. And then maybe that's all we can get out of rule number 2, so we can move on to rule number 3. So number 3 says that if it has at least 5, then it distinguishes between B and D and also has a unique word for E. So I think the second part of this is going to be very important because there's probably not that many words that are completely unique to just one column, but this rule states that for column E, every single color term is going to be a completely unique term. So we can try to see if there are any like that. So starting at 5, we see that there's this gra term that appears in all of these columns, so this cannot be E. There's also this glue bond term that repeats here and here, so it's not going to be ripe strawberry. And then over here we see paban twice and we see fiban twice. So that just leaves ripe banana, which means we now know that this is E. And then we can't really do that much with the first part of it right now. Just realize that after apinaye, B and D are going to be separate words. Okay, and then if we read the next 2 rules, they're not really going to give us too much right now because we don't have any of the information that would be necessary for it. So we can go back up to kind of the first few rules. Mainly, I think we can figure out something from number 2 now, because if you remember, this one says that all languages with at least 3 color terms will use different words for A, B, and C. And if we look at Bete, we can see that the 3 different words it has are Phi, and then KP, I don't know how you pronounce that, and then Zeli. So essentially what this rule means is that A, B, and C all have to be one of the columns under each of these groups. So we did that before with Phi, where we figure out Phi has to be one of A or C because there's only one option for it. For KP, we don't know because there's still 5 different columns that A, B, or C could be at. But for Zeli, since we know that E is this column right here, we can conclude that this other Zeli must be under a category of A, B, or C because it's the only column with Zeli left, and we wouldn't be able to put two of A, B, or C under KP because then it wouldn't be distinguishing. So then from there, we know that for the same reason why we know that this one isn't B, and then using the same rule number 2, if a language has 3 terms, the same word is used for both B and D. So let's say that this ripe strawberry column was really B, then Zeli and AB would have to be used for D. So that would mean that this column would have to be D, which is not true because we already proved that it's E. So with that reason, we can say that this column cannot be B. And then from there, because for each of the languages with 3 words, we have our A and C possibilities. We have our A and C possibilities for Zeli, for Phi. The only word that's left is KP and Yaga, kind of these words that are in the middle. So the only columns with words that are completely distinct from our A or C columns is going to be this KP and Yaga, 4 columns in the middle. So we can conclude that one of these columns is going to be B. And then since we know that at only 3 color terms, the same word is going to be used for B and D, then since these 4 columns are the only ones where the B column would match up with a word exactly like it, since all of them are KP and Yaga, and so on, then column D also has to be within these 4. If we know that B and D have to be 2 out of these 4 columns, then we can see if there's any that are going to be different every single time. So I'm seeing here that we have a repeated word 3 times, which means that B or D is going to have to be one of these over here, because they can't both be in this section of 3 columns. Otherwise, they would not be distinguished in the Seri language. And then from there, since we know that this column is going to be 1 out of B or D, Then we can compare this column to each of the other 3 columns and see if there's going to be any words that aren't distinguished. So for example, I see paban here and I see paban here, which means that if it were BD, if one of these were BD and one of these were BD, then they would not be distinguished. So that doesn't work. And yeah, that's as far as you can get with that rule for now. Okay, now if we jump to rule number 5, we can see that a language only has a unique word for G if it also has one for H. If it does not have a unique word for H, G will share a word with at least one of A, D, or F. And basically what the second part means is that H and G are always going to either be 1 and 1, so H will have one unique term and G will have one unique term, or they're going to be multiple and multiple. So H will have a word that is also within the language at least one more time, and same with G. So if we look at the remaining columns that we have ripe plum, deep ocean, and then one of fresh brass and clear sky that can G or H. And because of that, let's say we take a look at this language Tlapanek over here. Because from what we have here, we can conclude that G and H are going to match with either a column from Minu or a column from Maxa, respectively. So either G is going to match up with one of the Maxa columns or H's, and then the other one is going to match up with one of the Minu columns. And the reason for this is, let's say that it was G or H is under Minu, and then the other G or H is also under Minu. Then, according to this rule, H would not be a unique word, which means that G would have to share a word with at least one of A, D, or F. And if we look at this, let's say this is G or H as we said, and this is G or H as we said, then whichever one is G, it doesn't matter which one is G, it's not going to be able to share one with A, D, or F because there's only 2 instances of Minu. So from that we can conclude that this G or H is going to be an instance of the multiple of the same word that would correspond to the H column and multiple of the same word that would correspond with the G column. And with that we can conclude that either G is going to match with one of the Maxa columns and H would match with one of the Minu columns, or it would be the other way around, where H is the Maxa and G is the Minu. They can't be the same because otherwise G wouldn't be able to share with A, D, or F. And now looking back at rule number 5, we can use the second part again, where if it does not have a unique word for H, G will also share a word with at least one of A, D, or F. And if we look at the languages with exactly 7 terms, then we can use this to determine some new information. So we can see that there's this repeated term in both of these columns, clear sky and deep ocean. And basically what the second part of this rule is saying is that if H is shared with another term, then that means that G is going to also share a word. So in other words, if H shares a word, then there's going to be another pair of words somewhere. And in these languages with 7 terms, we only see one pair. Let's say that one of these was H. Then we'd follow this rule where if it does not have a unique word for H, which is true, there is no unique word for H, and then the second part of the statement, G will also share a word, cannot be true because there are no more words to share. So from that we can conclude that neither of these columns are H, because otherwise we'd be able to find another match somewhere in the English language. But since we only have one match here, then we know that neither of these matched words could be H. And I'm gonna cut it there because this video is already very long, but I'll definitely do the other parts of this problem in a future video that'll hopefully come out very soon. And yeah, I'll see you in the next part. Thank you for watching.